Jake Miller pressed his face against the small window of the transport ship as it came closer to Zephyr Prime, the planet. Looked like a giant blue marble floating in space. Its surface was covered with shining cities that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. Jake had never seen anything so beautiful in his 16 years of life. "Are you ready for this, son?" asked Captain Rogers, the human pilot who had brought Jake on this long journey from Earth. The older man looked worried. "Remember, you're the first human to ever step foot on their world. Everything you do will be watched." Jake nodded and tried to calm his racing heart. 3 months ago, he had been just another high school student in Denver, Colorado. Now, he was about to become the first human exchange student in the history of two species. The Zephyrian Empire had agreed to take one human student as part of a new peace treaty. Out of millions of candidates, they had chosen Jake. He still did not understand why. His grades were good but not perfect. He was not the smartest kid in his class. He was not even the tallest. At 5 feet 8 inches, he was actually shorter than most of his classmates back home. But somehow, the Zephyrians had picked him. The transport ship landed with a soft bump on a landing pad made of some kind of crystal material. Jake grabbed his single bag of belongings and followed Captain Rogers to the exit. The doors opened with a hiss, and Jake stepped onto an alien world for the first time. The first thing he noticed was how clean everything looked. The air smelled fresh and sweet like flowers after rain. The buildings around them were tall and graceful, made of the same crystal material as the landing pad. They seemed to glow with their own inner light. "Welcome to Zephyr Prime," said a voice behind him. Jake turned to see his first Zephyrian in person. She was tall, almost 7 feet, with smooth blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the light. Her eyes were large and silver, and her hair was white as snow. She wore a long flowing robe that moved like water. "I am Coordinator Vextala," she said. Her voice was musical like wind chimes. "I am the headmistress of Celestial Academy, where you will be studying." Jake tried to speak but found his mouth was dry. He swallowed and tried again. "Thank you for having me," he managed to say. Coordinator Vextala looked down at him with what might have been amusement. "You are smaller than we expected," she said. "And your thoughts are silent. How curious." Jake did not understand what she meant about his thoughts being silent, but he did not ask. Captain Rogers had warned him to be polite and not ask too many questions on his first day. "Come," said Coordinator Vextala. "Let me show you to your new home." They walked through the crystal city toward the academy. Jake saw other Zephyrians moving about their daily business. They were all tall and graceful, with the same blue skin and silver eyes. Some of them stopped to stare at Jake as he passed. He heard them making soft musical sounds to each other, which he guessed was their way of talking. The Celestial Academy was the most beautiful building Jake had ever seen. It was made of clear crystal that seemed to reach up to the clouds. Inside, the walls glowed with soft blue light. The floors were smooth and warm under his feet. "Your room is on the 3rd level," said Coordinator Vextala as they walked through long hallways. "You will share this level with the other students in your class. They are all female, as is traditional for advanced studies in our society." Jake's stomach dropped. "All female?" he asked. "Yes," said Coordinator Vextala. "Is this a problem for your species?" No problem," Jake said quickly, even though he felt nervous. He had never been the only boy in a class before. They reached his room, which was simple but comfortable. There was a bed, a desk, and a large window that looked out over the crystal city. Jake set down his bag and looked around. "Classes begin tomorrow morning," said Coordinator Vextala. "You will be studying xenobiology with Professor Xyleth. She is one of our finest teachers." After the headmistress left, Jake sat on his bed and looked out the window. The sun was setting and the crystal buildings were lighting up like stars. He thought about his family back on Earth and wondered if he had made a mistake coming here. The next morning, Jake woke up early and put on his best clothes. They were simple compared to the flowing robes he had seen the Zephyrians wearing, but they were clean and neat. He made his way through the crystal hallways, following the directions Coordinator Vextala had given him. The classroom was large and bright, with windows that looked out over a garden filled with strange alien plants. 12 female Zephyron. Students were already sitting in chairs arranged in a circle. They all looked up when Jake entered the room. The silence was complete. Jake could feel their silver eyes studying him from head to toe. He had never felt so small and out of place in his life. "You may sit there," said a voice from the front of the room. Jake turned to see Professor Xyleth, who was even taller than Coordinator Vextela. She pointed to an empty chair in the circle. Jake walked over and sat down. The chair was too big for him, and his feet barely touched the floor. He could hear some of the students making soft musical sounds to each other. He wished he could understand what they were saying. "Students," said Professor Xyleth, "today we begin a new chapter in our studies. We have with us a primitive specimen from the planet Earth. His name is Jake Miller, and he will be observing our classes for the next year." Jake felt his face turn red. Being called a primitive specimen was not a good way to start. One of the students raised her hand. She had longer hair than the others and wore a robe with silver designs on it. "Professor Xyleth," she said in perfect English, "how primitive is this specimen? Can it understand our language?" "I can understand you perfectly," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And I can speak for myself." The student who had asked the question looked surprised. "It speaks," she said to the others. "And it seems to have emotions. How interesting." Jake felt angry but tried not to show it. "My name is Jake," he said, "and I'm here to learn, just like you are." The students looked at each other and made more musical sounds. Jake realized they were talking to each other in their own language, probably about him. Professor Xyleth clapped her hands together. "Enough," she said. "Let us begin today's lesson. We will be studying the ecosystems of the outer rim planets. Jake Miller, you will observe and take notes. Do not speak unless spoken to." As the lesson began, Jake tried to understand what was happening. The Zephyrian students seemed to be learning without books or computers. They would sit quietly for a moment, then suddenly know the answer to Professor Xyleth's questions. It was like they were all connected somehow. The student with the silver designs on her robe seemed to be the leader of the group. She answered most of the questions, and the others looked to her for guidance. Jake heard Professor Xyleth call her Kira single quotes Lynn. Jake tried to take notes, but everything was happening so fast. The students were discussing complex biological systems that he had never heard of. He began to worry that he was in over his head. Then Professor Xyleth asked a question that made everyone go quiet. "Who can tell me why the ecosystem on Valdris 7 collapsed last year despite all our efforts to save it?" The students sat in silence. Even Carolyn looked puzzled. Jake found himself thinking about the problem. From what he had heard, it sounded like the scientists had tried to fix the ecosystem by adding new species, but it had made things worse instead of better. Without thinking, Jake raised his hand. "Maybe they tried to fix it too fast," he said. All eyes turned to Jake when he raised his hand. The silence in the room was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. Professor Xyleth looked at him with surprise, as if she had forgotten he was there. "What did you say?" she asked. Jake felt his face getting hot, but he continued. "Maybe they tried to fix the ecosystem too fast. Back on Earth, when we try to help damaged areas, we learn that nature needs time to balance itself. If you add too many new things at once, it can make the problem worse." The Zephyrian students looked at each other and made their musical sounds again. Jake could tell they were surprised that he had spoken up. Carolyn, the student with silver designs on her robe, turned to face him directly. "You think our scientists made a mistake?" she asked. Her voice was cold. "I don't know about your scientists," Jake said carefully. "I just know that on Earth we learned that slow changes work better than fast ones. Maybe the ecosystem on Valdris 7 needed time to heal on its own." Professor Xyleth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That is an interesting observation. However, our methods are based on thousands of years of advanced science. I do not think a primitive species like yours would understand the complexity of what we do." Jake felt disappointed but not surprised. He had expected them to dismiss his ideas. He went back to taking notes and tried to stay quiet for the rest of the class. When the lesson ended, the students gathered their things and began to leave. Jake was packing his notebook when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see two of the Zephyrian girls approaching him. One was tall, even for a Zephyrian, with intricate braids in her white hair. The other was shorter, with curious silver eyes that seemed to sparkle with interest. "I am Mirasith," said the taller one, "and this is Lyravin. We wanted to ask you something." Jake stood up, though he was still much shorter than both of them. "What do you want to know?" "Your idea." "About the ecosystem," said Lyravin. "Where did it come from? Did you access the knowledge banks before class?" Jake looked confused. "Knowledge banks? I don't know what that means." Mirasith and Lyravin exchanged glances. "How do you learn things?" asked Mirasith. "How do you share information with other humans?" "We talk to each other," Jake said, "or we read books, or we look things up on computers." "Why?" The two girls looked amazed. "You mean you cannot connect to the shared consciousness?" asked Lyravin. "Shared consciousness?" Jake repeated. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Mirasith sat down in one of the chairs and gestured for Jake to sit as well. "All Zephyrians are connected through our minds," she explained. "We can share thoughts, knowledge, and feelings instantly. When we learn something new, we can pass it to others without speaking." Jake's mouth fell open. "You can read each other's minds?" "Not exactly read," said Lyravin. "More like, we are all part of the same large mind. We can choose to share or keep thoughts private, but most of the time we share everything." "That's incredible," Jake said, "but also kind of scary. Don't you ever want to think your own thoughts?" The two girls looked at each other again. "Why would we want to do that?" asked Mirasith. "Sharing knowledge makes us stronger and smarter." "But what about creativity?" Jake asked. "Don't you ever want to come up with your own ideas?" Lyravin tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Jake thought for a moment. "Well, like my idea about the ecosystem. I thought of it because I remembered something from my own experience. If I was connected to everyone else's mind, I might not have thought of it because I would have been thinking the same thoughts as everyone else." The two girls were quiet for a long time. Finally, Mirasith said, "We never thought of it that way." Over the next few days, Jake began to settle into a routine at the academy. He attended classes with the 12 female students, 8 meals in the dining hall, and spent his evenings studying in his room. But he noticed that some of the students were starting to pay more attention to him in their xenobiology class. Professor Xyleth continued to present complex problems that had been puzzling Zephyrian scientists. The students would sit quietly, accessing their shared knowledge, and then give answers that were technically correct, but didn't actually solve the problems. Jake found himself thinking about these problems in different ways. When Professor Xyleth talked about a planet where all the plants were dying, Jake thought about soil chemistry and water drainage. When she discussed a species that was becoming extinct, Jake wondered about their food sources and breeding habits. At first, he kept his thoughts to himself. But as the days passed, he began to notice that his ideas were often different from what the Zephyrian students were thinking. And sometimes his ideas seemed to make more sense. One morning, Professor Xyleth presented a problem that had been troubling the Zephyrian Empire for months. A colony world called Nexus 4 was experiencing massive crop failures. The colonists were in danger of starvation. "Our best scientists have analyzed the soil, the climate, and the genetic structure of the crops," Professor Xyleth explained. "Everything appears to be perfect, yet the crops continue to fail. Who can explain this mystery?" The students sat in their usual silence, accessing the shared knowledge. Carolyn raised her hand first. "The soil composition is optimal," she said. "The weather patterns are ideal. The crop genetics are superior to anything found in nature. There is no logical explanation for the failures." Other students nodded in agreement. They had all accessed the same information and reached the same conclusion. Jake raised his hand tentatively. "May I ask a question?" Professor Xyleth looked annoyed. "What is it? Have they checked for insects or small animals that might be eating the crops?" The room went silent. Professor Xyleth stared at Jake. Insects? She repeated. Yes, Jake said. On Earth, we have lots of problems with bugs and small animals that eat our crops. Sometimes they're so small or well hidden that we don't notice. Them at first, Carolyn looked confused. But our scientists would have detected any life forms that could damage the crops. Maybe, Jake said. But what if the insects are native to that planet and the scientists weren't looking for them? What if they're so small that the advanced scanners missed them? Professor Xyleth was quiet for a long moment. Then she activated a communication device on her desk. Jake heard her speaking in the musical Zephyrian language. After a few minutes, she turned back to the class. I have contacted the research team on Nexus 4, she said. They will investigate your suggestion. The next day, Professor Xyleth announced that Jake had been correct. The crops on Nexus 4 were being destroyed by tiny native insects that were so small they had been overlooked by the advanced scanning equipment. Once the colonists started using simple Earth-style pest control methods, the problem was solved. Jake felt proud, but he also noticed that the other students were looking at him differently. Some seemed impressed, while others appeared confused, or even worried. After class, Carolyn approached him. How did you think of that solution? She asked. Jake shrugged. It just made sense. When I heard about crops failing for no reason, I thought about similar problems on Earth. But you did not access any information banks, Carolyn said. You did not consult with other humans. You just of it on your own. That's how humans usually solve problems, Jake said. We think about what we know and try to come up with new ideas. Carolyn looked troubled. But how do you know if your ideas are correct if you do not check them against the collective knowledge? Jake thought about this. We don't always know. If our ideas are correct, sometimes we're wrong. But sometimes we're right in ways that nobody expected. That evening, Jake was studying in his room when he heard a soft knock on his door. He opened it to find Mirasith and Lyravin standing outside. May we come in? Asked Myra Seth. Jake stepped aside to let them enter. They looked around his simple room with interest. We wanted to ask you more about human thinking, said Lyravin. Today in class, you solved a problem that our best scientists could not solve. How is this possible? Jake sat down on his bed while the two girls took the chairs by his desk. I don't know if I'm smarter than your scientists, he said. I think I just look at problems differently. How so? Asked Mirasith. Well, your scientists were looking at the big picture, Jake explained. They were analyzing soil and weather and genetics, but I was thinking about the small details. I was imagining what it would be like to be a plant trying to grow on that planet. You imagine being a plant? Lyravin sounded amazed. Sort of, Jake said. It's hard to explain. Humans do this thing called empathy. We try to understand what other people or even other living things might be feeling or experiencing. The two girls exchanged glances. We do not have this ability, said Mirasith. We can share thoughts with other Zephyrians, but we cannot understand the experiences of other species. Maybe that's why I could solve the problem, Jake said. I wasn't just thinking about the technical aspects. I was thinking about what might be bothering the plants. Lyravin leaned forward. Could you teach us to think this way? Jake looked surprised. You want to learn human thinking? Yes, said Mirasith. We are curious about these individual thoughts you have. We want to understand how you can solve problems that we cannot. Jake smiled. I can try to teach you. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake noticed that more of the Zephyrian students were starting to ask him questions. What had begun with just Mirasith and Lyravin was slowly spreading to others in the class. During their xenobiology lessons, Professor Xyleth continued to present unsolved problems from across the Zephyrian Empire. Each time, the students would connect to their shared consciousness and give the same answers that had already been tried and failed. But Jake would think about the problems in his own way, often coming up with simple solutions that nobody had. Considered, when a mining colony reported that their equipment kept breaking down in ways that made no sense, Jake suggested they check if the metal was expanding and contracting due to temperature changes. When a research station complained about strange noises in their walls, Jake wondered if small animals had gotten inside the building. Each time, Jake turned out to be right. The mining equipment was failing because the extreme day and night temperatures on the planet were causing the metal to crack. The research station was indeed home to tiny native creatures that had made nests in the walls. Carolyn, who had been the most skeptical of Jake's ideas, was beginning to look at him with something that might have been respect. During one class, she raised her hand and asked Professor Xyleth a question that surprised everyone. "Professor, why do we always approach problems by accessing the collective knowledge first?" she asked. "What if we tried to think about problems individually before consulting the shared consciousness?" Professor Xyleth looked shocked. "Individual thinking is primitive and inefficient," she said. "Why would we want to limit ourselves to the knowledge of just one mind when we can access the wisdom of billions?" But Jake's individual thinking has solved problems that our collective wisdom could not. Carolyn pointed out the other students began making musical sounds to each other, which Jake had learned meant they were having a rapid conversation. Through their mental connection, Professor Xyleth looked uncomfortable. "Jake's solutions are simple because the problems were simple," she said. "Our scientists were looking for complex solutions because they assumed the problems were complex. It was an oversight, nothing more." Jake felt disappointed but not surprised. He was getting used to having his ideas dismissed even when they worked. That afternoon, Jake was in his room doing homework when an alarm started blaring throughout the academy. The sound was loud and urgent, unlike anything he had heard before. He looked out his window and saw Zephyrian adults running through the crystal corridors. His door burst open and Mirasith ran in, looking frightened. "Jake, we need to evacuate," she said. "The biodome is failing." Jake grabbed his jacket and followed her into the hallway. Students and teachers were moving quickly but calmly toward the exits. Jake could see flashing lights coming from the direction of the academy's biodome, a huge crystal structure that provided fresh air and food for the entire complex. "What's happening?" Jake asked as they walked. "The environmental systems are shutting down," Mirasith explained. "If we cannot fix it quickly, the entire academy will become uninhabitable." They reached the main courtyard where all the students and teachers had gathered. Coordinator Vexthala was speaking to a group of maintenance workers in Rapid Zephyrian. She looked worried. Professor Xyleth approached the group of students. "The situation is serious," she announced. "Our best engineers are analyzing the problem, but they estimate it will take at least 6 hours to understand what went wrong and develop a solution." "6 hours?" asked Lerevin. "But the dome will be completely dead by then." "The emergency systems will keep us alive," said Professor Xyleth. "But yes, if we cannot repair the dome, we will have to abandon the academy." Jake looked up at the biodome. Even from a distance, he could see that the lights inside were flickering and dim. Through the transparent walls, he could see that the plants inside were already beginning to wilt. "What exactly is wrong with it?" he asked. Professor Xyleth looked at him with annoyance. "The primary environmental processor has suffered a cascade failure. The backup systems are also failing. It is a complex technical problem that requires advanced engineering knowledge to solve." Jake nodded, but he kept looking at the dome. Something about the way the lights were flickering reminded him of an old problem they had had with the greenhouse at his school back on Earth. "Are the engineers looking at the mechanical systems or the computer systems?" he asked. "Both, of course," said Professor Xyleth. "They are running full diagnostics on every component." "What about the basic connections?" Jake asked. "Like the power cables and the water pipes?" Several of the students looked at him strangely. Carolyn stepped forward. "What do you mean?" "Sometimes when complex systems fail, it's not because something complicated broke," Jake explained. "Sometimes it's because something simple came loose or got blocked." Professor Xyleth shook her head. "Our systems are far too advanced for such simple failures. The engineers would have detected any basic mechanical problems immediately." Jake looked at the dome again. The lights were getting dimmer. "Can I take a look?" he asked. "Absolutely not," said Coordinator Vextella, who had walked over to join the conversation. "The dome is sealed off for safety reasons. Only trained engineers are allowed inside." "But what if I'm right?" Jake asked. "What if it's something simple that the engineers aren't looking for because they're focused on the complex stuff?" "You are not qualified to diagnose advanced Zephyrian technology," said Coordinator Vextella firmly. Jake felt frustrated. He could see that the dome was getting worse every minute. The plants inside were dying, and the air recycling systems were failing. If he was right about it being a simple problem, every minute they waited would make it harder to fix. Mirasith stepped forward. "What if we went with him?" she asked. "We could supervise and make sure he doesn't damage anything." "It is too dangerous," said Coordinator Vextella. "More dangerous than losing the entire academy?" asked Carolyn. To Jake's surprise, she was supporting his idea. Lyrevan nodded. "Jake has been right about every problem so far. What if he's right about this one too?" Coordinator Vextella looked around at the gathered students. Many of them were nodding in agreement. Even some of the teachers looked curious about what Jake might find. "If you are wrong," she said to Jake, "you could make the problem worse. You could endanger everyone in the academy." "If I'm wrong, I'll take full responsibility," Jake said. "But if I'm right, we could save the academy." After a long moment, Coordinator Vextella nodded. "Very well, but you will be accompanied by Professor Xyleth and 2 of our best engineers. You will touch nothing without permission." Jake felt relieved. "Thank you." They walked to the biodome entrance. 2 Zephyrian engineers were waiting there with diagnostic equipment. They looked skeptical when they saw Jake. "This is highly irregular," said one of them. "A primitive alien examining our advanced systems." "Just let him look," said Professor Xyleth. "We will be monitoring everything he does." They entered the dome through an airlock. Inside, Jake could see that the situation was worse than it had appeared from outside. The plants were wilting rapidly, and the air felt stale and warm. The lights were flickering more frequently. "The main environmental processor is over there," said one of the engineers, pointing to a complex machine in the center of the dome. "Our diagnostics show multiple system failures, but we cannot determine the root cause." Jake walked over to the machine. It was covered with lights, displays, and control panels. Everything looked incredibly advanced and complicated. But Jake ignored the fancy parts and looked at the basics. "Where does the power come from?" he asked. The engineer pointed to a thick cable that connected to the wall. "The primary power conduit?" Jake followed the cable with his eyes. It ran along the wall, through several junction boxes, and then disappeared into the floor. As he traced its path, he noticed something strange. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to a spot where the cable seemed to be bent at an odd angle. The engineer looked where Jake was pointing. "That is just a routing junction. The cable passes through there to reach the main power grid." Jake walked over to the junction box. It was about 3 feet off the ground, mounted on the wall. The cable went into the box and then out again, but something looked wrong. "Can you open this box?" he asked. The engineer looked annoyed. "That is unnecessary. Our diagnostics show that power is flowing through that junction normally." "But look at the cable," Jake said. "It's bent too sharply." "On Earth, we learned that electrical cables can break inside if they're bent too much, even if they still look okay on the outside." Professor Xyleth stepped forward. "Open the junction box," she ordered. The engineer reluctantly opened the box. Inside, Jake could see where the cable connected to the power grid. Everything looked normal, but Jake noticed something the engineer had missed. "There," he said, pointing to a small bracket that was supposed to hold the cable in place. "That support bracket is broken." The engineer looked more closely. "I do not see how that could affect the power flow." "The cable is hanging by its own weight," Jake explained. "Over time, that would stress the internal wires. They might be breaking one by one." Jake pointed to the cable itself. "Look at this section. It's thinner than the rest. The wires inside are probably damaged." Word about Jake's success with the biodome spread quickly through the academy. Within days, students from other classes were coming to watch him during xenobiology lessons. Some teachers from different departments started attending Professor Xylith's classes to observe the human boy who solved problems in ways they had never seen before. Jake found the attention both exciting and nerve-wracking. He was no longer just sitting quietly in the back of the class. Now, whenever Professor Xylith presented a problem, all eyes turned to him to see what he would say. The change was most obvious in his classmates. Carolyn, who had once called him a primitive specimen, now asked him questions about human thinking methods. Mirasith and Leiravin spent their free time with Jake, learning how to approach problems without immediately connecting to the shared consciousness. "It is harder than I expected," Leiravin admitted one evening as they sat in the Academy's garden. "When I try to think individually, I feel lost and confused. How do you humans manage without the collective knowledge?" Jake thought about this. "We learn to trust our own thoughts," he said. "And we're not afraid to be wrong. Sometimes being wrong teaches us more than being right." "But how do you know if your thoughts are correct without checking them against others?" asked Mirasith. "We test our ideas," Jake explained. "We try things and see what happens. If they work, we keep using them. If they don't work, we try something else." The girls looked fascinated by this concept. "You mean you would rather try a wrong idea than not try any idea at all?" asked Leiravin. "Sometimes," Jake said, "because even wrong ideas can lead us to right ones." Meanwhile, Jake noticed that Professor Xylith was becoming more interested in his methods. She had started asking him to explain his thinking process whenever he solved a problem. At first, Jake thought she was just being polite, but he soon realized she was genuinely curious about human cognitive patterns. "Your approach is completely illogical," she told him after one class. "Yet it produces results that our logical methods cannot achieve. I find this very troubling." "Why troubling?" Jake asked. "Because it suggests that our entire educational system may be flawed," Professor Xylith said. "For thousands of years, we have taught our students to rely on collective knowledge and logical analysis. But you solve problems using intuition and individual creativity. If your methods are superior, then we have been wrong about everything." Jake felt bad that his success was causing her distress. "Maybe both methods are good," he suggested. "Maybe your way works for some problems and my way works for others." Professor Xylith looked thoughtful. "Perhaps," she said. "But that would require us to completely change how we teach our students. Would that be so bad?" Jake asked Dot before Professor Xylith could answer. Coordinator Vextella appeared in the doorway of the classroom. She looked serious and worried. "Professor Xylith, I need to speak with you privately," she said. Then she looked at Jake. "You should come as well." They followed Coordinator Vextella to her office, which was at the top of the Academy's tallest crystal tower. The walls were transparent, giving a view of the entire city below. "I have received a communication from the Zephyrian Council," Coordinator Vextella said. "They are concerned about the reports coming from our academy." "What kind of reports?" asked Professor Xylith. "Reports about Jake's influence on our students," Coordinator Vextella said. "They have heard that he is teaching our students to think individually instead of collectively. They view this as a threat to our society." Jake felt his stomach drop. "A threat?" "The Council believes that individual thinking could lead to chaos and disorder," Coordinator Vextella explained. "Our entire civilization is based on unity of thought and purpose. If people start thinking for themselves, they might start disagreeing with each other. They might stop working together." "But individual thinking has helped solve problems," Professor Xylith pointed out. "Jake has been successful where our collective methods have failed." The Council acknowledges this," said Coordinator Vextella. "But they believe the risks outweigh the benefits. They have ordered me to end the exchange program and send Jake back to Earth." Jake felt like he had been punched in the stomach. "When?" he asked quietly. "The transport ship will arrive tomorrow," Coordinator Vextella said. "I'm sorry, Jake. I know you have come to care about our academy and our students." Jake nodded, unable to speak. He had finally found a place where he felt useful and important, and now it was being taken away from him. There's one other thing, Coordinator Vextala continued. The Council has also ordered that none of our students should have further contact with humans. They want to prevent the spread of individual thinking. Professor Xyleth looked shocked. They are banning contact with an entire species because of one student's influence? They believe it is necessary to protect our way of life, Coordinator. Vexthala said that evening, Jake sat in his room packing his few belongings. He felt sad and angry at the same time. He had not asked to change anything about Zephyrian society. He had just tried to help when problems needed solving. There was a soft knock on his door. When he opened it, he found Carolyn standing outside. Behind her were Mirasith, Lyravan, and several other students from his class. "We heard about the Council's decision," Carolyn said. "We wanted to talk to you before you leave." Jake let them into his room. They sat on the floor in a circle, just like they did in class. "We do not want you to go," said Mirasith. "And we do not want to stop learning from you," added Lyravan. Jake looked around at their faces. "I don't want to leave either," he said. "But I understand why your council is worried. Individual thinking can be dangerous if people aren't used to it, but it can also be wonderful," said Carolyn. "These past weeks I have learned to think thoughts that are mine alone. I have discovered ideas that came from my own mind, not from the collective consciousness. It is frightening, but it is also exciting. What if we could show the Council that individual thinking does not have to be dangerous?" asked Mirasith. "What if we could prove that it can make our society stronger, not weaker?" Jake looked confused. "How would we do that?" "We call ourselves the independent thinkers now," said Lyravan. "We have been practicing the methods you taught us. We solve problems individually first, and then we share our solutions with each other, and we have been very successful," added another student. "Yesterday we solved 3 different engineering problems that had been troubling our teachers for months." Carolyn leaned forward. "We want to make a formal presentation to the Council. We want to show them that human thinking methods can help our people without destroying our unity. Would they listen to you?" Jake asked. "They have to," said Mirasith. "We are students at the most prestigious academy in the Empire. Our voices carry weight." "But what if they say no?" Jake asked. "What if they decide to punish you for supporting me?" The students looked at each other. "Then we will accept the consequences," said Carolyn. "But we believe that what we are doing is right. You have shown us that there are better ways to solve problems. We cannot pretend we do not know this." Jake felt moved by their loyalty and courage. "What do you want me to do?" "Help us prepare the presentation," said Lyravan. "Show us how to explain human thinking methods in ways the Council will understand. And stay one more day," added Mirasith. "Give us a chance to change their minds." Jake thought about this. If he stayed and the Council refused to listen, he would probably be in serious trouble. But if he left without trying, he would always wonder if things could have been different. "Okay," he said, "I'll help you prepare the presentation." The students spent the rest of the night working on their proposal. They divided into groups, with each group responsible for a different aspect of the presentation. Some worked on examples of problems that individual thinking had solved. Others focused on explaining how human methods could complement rather than replace. Zephyrian collective consciousness. Jake moved from group to group, helping them organize their thoughts and explaining human concepts that were difficult for them to understand. He was amazed at how quickly they had learned to think independently while still working together as a team. As the night wore on, Jake realized that something important was happening. The students were not just learning to think like humans. They were creating something new, a way of thinking that combined the best of both human and Zephyrian approaches. "You know," he said to Carolyn as they worked on the final presentation, "you don't need to choose between individual thinking and collective consciousness. You can use both." Carolyn looked up from her notes. "What do you mean?" "You can think about problems individually first, coming up with creative solutions," Jake explained. "Then you can share those solutions through your mental connection and build on each other's ideas. That way, you get the benefits of both approaches." Carolina's eyes lit up with understanding. So we would have the creativity of individual thinking and the power of collective knowledge. Exactly, Jake said. It would make you stronger than either approach alone. As dawn broke over the Crystal City, the students had finished their presentation. They had examples, explanations, and a detailed proposal for how Zephyrian education could be improved by incorporating human thinking methods. The council chambers were located in the heart of the Crystal City, inside a massive building that reached toward the clouds. Jake had never seen anything so impressive. The walls were made of the same glowing crystal as the academy, but they were much thicker and more elaborate. As Jake and the 12 students approached the entrance, they could see other Zephyrians gathering outside the building. Word had spread about the presentation, and many citizens had come to watch. I have never seen so many people interested in a council meeting, whispered Lyravin. They are curious about the human boy who has been causing so much discussion, said Myra Seth. Inside the chambers, the council members sat in a semicircle on elevated platforms. There were 7 of them, all elderly Zephyrians with silver robes and serious expressions. At the center sat High Counselor Zarathex, the leader of the Zephyrian Empire. Coordinator Vextala and Professor Xyleth were already seated in the audience section. They looked nervous as Jake and the students took their places. High Counselor Zarathex stood up and addressed the gathering. Her voice carried easily through the large chamber without any need for amplification. We are here today to discuss the human exchange program and its effects on our society, she announced. We have received reports that concern us greatly. Reports of our young people abandoning the collective consciousness that has guided our civilization for thousands of years. She looked directly at Jake. We have also heard that this human boy has been teaching our students to think individually, which goes against everything we believe about proper mental function. Jake felt his heart beating fast, but he tried to remain calm. High Counselor, Zarathex continued, the Council has already decided to end this exchange program and return the human to his home planet. However, we have agreed to hear from the students before we implement additional measures to prevent future contamination of our collective consciousness. Kirillin stood up. High Counselor, we respectfully request permission to present our findings about human thinking methods. You may proceed, said High Counselor Zarathex, though she did not sound pleased. Kirillin walked to the center of the chamber. Jake could see that she was nervous, but her voice was steady and strong. Honored council members, she began, we understand your concerns about individual thinking. We too were worried when we first encountered Jake's methods. But what we have learned has not weakened us. It has made us stronger. She gestured to her fellow students. We call ourselves the independent thinkers, but we have not abandoned our connection to each other or to our society. Instead, we have learned to use both individual creativity and collective knowledge to solve problems better than either method alone. One of the council members, an stern-looking female named Counselor Thyravex, interrupted. You speak of solving problems, but what problems could possibly require abandoning our time-tested methods? Mirasith stood up. May we demonstrate? She asked. High Counselor Zarathex nodded reluctantly. Mirasith walked to a display screen at the front of the chamber. 3 days ago, the mining operation on Kepler 9 reported a problem that our best engineers could not solve. The extraction equipment was producing only half the expected output, and no one could determine why. She activated the display, showing technical diagrams of the mining operation. Our collective analysis identified 17 possible causes and recommended 17 different solutions. None of them worked. Lyravin joined her at the display. But when we applied individual thinking methods, we approached the problem differently. Instead of analyzing the equipment, we imagined what it would be like to be a piece of, or trying to move through the system. Several council members looked confused by this statement. We discovered that the problem was not with the equipment, Mirasith continued. The problem was with the ore itself. The deposits on Kepler 9 contain a mineral that becomes sticky when heated. The ore was getting stuck in the transport tubes. The solution was simple, added Lyravin. cool the transport tubes to prevent the ore from heating up. The mining operation is now producing twice the expected output. Counselor Thyrovex looked skeptical. This is just one example. It proves nothing about the value of individual thinking. Carolyn smiled. We have more examples. For the next 30 minutes, the students presented case after case of problems they had solved using individual thinking methods. They showed how they had helped improve crop yields on 3 different planets, fixed transportation systems in 2 major cities, and even solved a diplomatic dispute between 2 colony worlds with each example. Jake could see that the council members were becoming more interested and less hostile. Finally, High Counselor Zarathex raised her hand for silence. These results are impressive, she admitted. But we remain concerned about the long-term effects of individual thinking on our society. How do we know that teaching people to think independently will not lead to chaos and disorder? Carolyn looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. This was the most important part of their presentation. Because we are not choosing between individual thinking and collective consciousness, Carolyn said. We are combining them. We think individually first to generate creative ideas, then we share those ideas through our mental connection to build on each other's thoughts. She gestured to her fellow students. We are still connected to each other and to our society. But now we can also contribute unique perspectives that come from our individual minds. In fact, added Miraseth, we believe this combination makes our collective consciousness stronger. When everyone contributes the same thoughts, the collective becomes stagnant. But when individuals contribute different ideas, the collective becomes more creative and powerful. High Counselor Zarathex was quiet for a long moment. Jake could see that she was thinking carefully about what the students had said. Suddenly, alarms began blaring throughout the chamber. Emergency lights started flashing, and Jake could hear people outside shouting in panic. The communication device on High Counselor Zarathex's platform activated, and an urgent voice spoke in rapid Zephyrian. Jake could not understand the words, but he could tell from everyone's reactions that something terrible was happening. Professor Xyleth stood up and spoke in English so Jake could understand. The planetary defense system has activated, she said. It is targeting our own cities. Hi. Counselor Zarathex looked pale. The ancient defense network was designed by our ancestors to protect Zephyria Prime from invasion, but it has malfunctioned. It now sees our own people as enemies. Can you shut it down? Asked Coordinator Vextela. Our best engineers are trying, said High Counselor Zarathex, but the system was designed to be resistant to tampering. It uses technology that we no longer fully understand. Jake stood up. What kind of technology? High Counselor Zarathex looked at him with surprise. Ancient mechanical systems combined with early telepathic interfaces. Why do you ask? Because mechanical systems are what I understand best, Jake said. And if the system was designed to resist telepathic interference, maybe it can be defeated by someone who doesn't use telepathy. You think you can help? Asked High Counselor Zarathex. I think we can help, Jake said, looking at his student. Friends, if we work together. High Counselor Zarathex hesitated for only a moment. Very well, what do you need? Within minutes, Jake and the independent thinkers were on their way to the Defense Control Center. The building was surrounded by Zephyrian engineers and technicians, all working frantically to shut down the malfunctioning system. The system is completely automated, explained the chief engineer. It was designed to operate independently of any external control. Our ancestors wanted to make sure that enemies could not hack into it or shut it down. But that also means you can't shut it down when it malfunctions, Jake said. Exactly, the system is designed to ignore all telepathic commands and to resist all electronic interference. Jake looked at the massive control building. What about mechanical interference? Can you physically access the system? There are maintenance tunnels, said the engineer. But they are protected by security measures that we cannot override. What kind of security measures? Asked Carolyn. Puzzles and challenges designed to test intelligence and problem-solving ability, the engineer explained. But they require a combination of mechanical knowledge and telepathic ability to solve. Jake and the students looked at each other. What? If some of us have mechanical knowledge and others have telepathic ability, asked Mirasith. And what if we work together? Added Lyravin. The engineer looked confused. I do not understand. Jake can handle the mechanical puzzles, Carolyn explained. We can handle the telepathic challenges. Together we can get through the security system. But you would have to work as a team, said the engineer. The puzzles are designed to require both types of thinking simultaneously. That's exactly what we've learned to do, said Jake. High Counselor Zarathex, who had followed them to the control center, made a decision. Do it, she said. Jake and the 12 students entered the maintenance tunnels beneath the defense control building. The tunnels were dark and filled with ancient machinery that hummed with unknown power. The first challenge was a massive, mechanical lock with hundreds of moving parts.